chapter 18, verses 1 through 6. At that time, the disciples came to Jesus and asked, "Who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven?" He called a child whom he put among them and said, "Truly, I tell you, unless you change and become like children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me. If any of you put a stumbling block before one of these little ones who believe in me, it would be better for you if a great millstone were fastened around your neck and you were drowned in the depth of the sea." May God add blessing to the reading, hearing, and living of this holy word this day.
Thanks be to God.
Have a seat.
Children, and during this time time that he was on TV, I think he went back, he talks a lot about the childhood that he had growing up, and if you want to know more about that, you can read this book or the other book or anything else out there about Mr. Rogers. His life was not all roses, I'll tell you. So during this last month, the sermon series, we've been asked the question, or I've asked the question at the end of each sermon, what does the gospel look like according to you? And what would people see if they watched the episodes of your life? And I hope that during this course of this time that you've been able to get some insight on how important it is for us to live out the gospel that we as Christians say we believe. So for just another moment or two, I want us to go back to Mr. Rogers' neighborhood. Although we don't want to talk about it, we all know the truth of the matter, that the world is not the neighborhood that Mr. Rogers portrayed on TV. The real world isn't as kind or as loving. And this world of make-believe that Mr. Rogers shared, where everybody's kind and everybody does the right thing, we know that's not really how the world is. And we know that at least at the end of the 30 minutes together, that even if someone starts out with a little wrong idea, by the end of the 30 minutes, they're going to be okay. But we know that that's not how life works. And in our world today, we often hear horrible stories about children, especially being exploited or mistreated. And I have to tell you that it's these kinds of stories that bother me the most, I think, is when we hear the stories of what's happening to our vulnerable children. And so I think, as Mr. Rogers knew, that it's vitally important for us to take care of our children. And I want to say that when I say our children, I'm not meaning children women that you gave birth to or men that you fathered. I'm talking about children in general, because I believe that all children belong to all of us, and we're all responsible. So why were children so special to Mr. Rogers? And I think that one of the other reasons was that Mr. Rogers, I think, recognized the special connection that children have with God. Let me tell you one of the stories that Mr. Rogers loved to tell. He told the story, and he believed that it was as told as a true story, that there was a little 4-year-old boy whose mom and dad had brought home a new baby sister. And the little boy pleaded with his parents to have some private time with this baby. And as parents, they were a little concerned that he might be planning to harm the baby or something. They weren't quite sure. He was a pretty rambunctious little boy. But he was so insistent that he needed time alone with the baby that they decided to let him do that. And so as he went into the room where the baby was laying in her crib, the parents decided that they would stand just outside the door just to make sure that everything was safe. And the little boy walks over to the crib. He looks in at the baby and says, "Tell me what heaven is like. I'm beginning to forget." I think Fred worked with children, trying to help them preserve, as long as he could, this special connection that children have with God. He wanted them to keep it for just a little longer, this trust and acceptance that we seem to lose as we grow older. And for Fred too, he knew that as adults, the ones that would be watching with their children, that they needed maybe to have a reminder of the child that was still in them. And that even in the midst of all of the things that go on, even in an adult's life, that there was still a moment where they needed to recall that childlike innocence that they had as youngsters. So Mr. Rogers, even though he was billed as someone that talked only to children, he actually had a message for adults too. Perhaps adults, if you can recall, maybe you watched with your children, and maybe it was an eye-opening moment, or maybe you recall some times when those memories of watching Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, or having a moment with a child, when all that wonder and excitement is present in the eyes of the child. Mr. Rogers knew that children growing up needed continuous encouragement to have that quality of hope and excitement and joy at discovering all the new things that life would bring them. And in a sense, this is what our scripture lesson tells us today. A little different twist, but I think you'll see how it works. In the story in the scripture this morning, the disciples are acting, well, they're acting like children, really, but we'll get to that in a minute. Their disciples are trying to figure out, once again, who is the greatest in line of disciples. Remember, we talked about this last week with the church in Corinth, them trying to decide who was most important because of their spiritual gifts, blah, blah, blah. So the disciples are having another discussion, and basically what they're trying to decide is who should have the best seat at the table. That's what they were concerned about. And this, as I said, was not the first time this has come up. And so as this subject comes up, Jesus tells them that they need to become like children if they want to enter the kingdom of heaven. And I don't think this does anything to help with the discussion the disciples are having, but this is what he tells them. Because this story, if you go back and look, is in all of the Gospels. It's related in some way. A little different in each of the renditions, but essentially the same story. And the disciples are on the road. They're traveling back to Capernaum, which is the home of Peter and Andrew. That's the headquarters that Jesus had for his ministry while he was in Galilee. And in the scripture, it tells us that this discussion that they were having was supposedly out of the earshot of Jesus. But in Luke's gospel, he says that Jesus knew what they were talking about. And as a result, when they get back to Peter's house, Jesus asks them, as if he doesn't know what they were talking about, "So, what were you talking about on the way back?" And in Mark's gospel, he reports there's like a stunned silence. As the disciples, no doubt, I think they're looking back and forth at each other like, who wants to say who wants to tell them what we were talking about? Because the disciples know that their topic of conversation is totally inappropriate. But in the gospel lesson, one of the disciples decides to speak up for all of them, and he tries to frame the question in a way that he thinks might be more acceptable to Jesus. And so he leaves out, he just says, he asks this question. And this is in where we get from Matthew's version that was read to you this morning, about who is greatest. And this is what he says. Who is the greatest in heaven? Who's going to be the greatest in heaven? So the disciple thinks, we're not going to ask anymore about who's going to be greatest here on earth, because we know Jesus doesn't like us to do that. I'm going to ask him about who's going to be the greatest in heaven. Whole different thing. But once again, Jesus provides an incredible, unbelievable, and a counterintuitive answer. He says, if you want to be great, you have to be small. This is the kind of statement that was made repeatedly by Jesus during his ministry. Remember, he said it in different ways. Remember, he said the first shall be last? Or that to save your life, you have to lose your life? Those kinds of upside down, backward kind of thinking. And now he's saying once again to them, if you want to be great, you must be one of the least. You must become like a child. So Jesus is essentially saying to them, you need to go back to the time when you weren't filled with all this selfish ambition or pride or competitive spirit, and you must become as humble as a little child. And in some of the translations of the scripture, the statement is really a strong one because they interpret the word that Jesus uses as convert. And so the verb convert in Greek means to completely turn around and go in a completely different direction. So Jesus isn't saying, you just have to, do this little bit of something. No, Jesus is saying you have to turn around and go back to being like a child. Completely change the way that you're thinking. Go back to a time when you were the most vulnerable. Go back to the time when you were a child. Go back to that time when you were trusting, that you trusted those around you to take care of you, and that you were learning and growing to trust yourself. Return to that time when you marveled at everything around you because everything was new and exciting. He's saying go back to that time of great expectancy when you couldn't wait to see what you would discover next. He's telling them to go back to the time when you made friends with everyone and when you weren't clouded in your mind by prejudices. He's telling them to go back to a time of reliance on someone else for your food and your encouragement. He's telling them to go back to a time when they weren't so far from heaven that they could still remember God's love. I think he was telling them to go back to a time when they laughed with abandon and played hard and joyfully. Back to that time when they were children and weren't distracted by the cares of the world. That's what Jesus meant when he said you must become like a child. He wanted the disciples to go back to that moment in time when they were open and ready to discover new and exciting things, when they weren't worried about who was going to get the best seat at the table. And then Jesus says one more thing. He says, well, actually says two. He says, whoever receives a child in my name receives me. This is a big deal. Jesus is saying, however you respond to a child is ultimately the test of how you will respond to me. How is it that we respond to the children today? And does that response merit the kind of response that we should be offering to Christ? It's actually the ultimate test of our humility. And then the last thing that Jesus says in that scripture part was that you would be better off to have a millstone tied around your neck and be thrown into the lake than to be mistreating or not to understand what it is to be a child, to take care of a child. That's pretty dramatic. Jesus intended to make his point that the most important part of who we are is the innocence that we carry with us as children needs to continue with us so that we can still remain excited, open, loving, caring people that we were as children. Fred McFeely Rogers was a humble man, and he never thought of himself as a hero. But Mr. Rogers' idea of a hero being anyone who does anything to help a child, I think is how we should define a hero too. If we want to be great in God's kingdom, we need to become as a child. So are you beginning to get the idea of how important it is that we remember that we are all beloved children of God? Because that's exactly who we are. And I think as we grow up as an adult, we forget that we are children of God, beloved by God, and that we make the world a better place just by having us be who we are. This is the gospel according to Mr. Rogers. Let me ask you one last time. What is the gospel according to you? And when people see the episodes of your life